For the first time in its history, the National Weather Service issued a warning for Washington state that it has never issued before. Not a normal red flag warning, the kind that gets posted every summer and barely makes the local news. This was labeled a particularly dangerous situation, the highest tier of fire weather alert that exists, a phrase meteorologists reserve for conditions so extreme that any spark, anywhere, has the potential to become unstoppable. That warning went out across central and eastern Washington. Within hours, it proved to be exactly right. 12 major wildfires were already burning across the state. A 13th was about to ignite west of Spokane and become the most destructive urban wildfire event the region has seen in generations. 6 counties, 3 sovereign tribal nations, 1 governor's signature on an emergency declaration. That is what a statewide emergency actually looks like once you stop reading the headline and start reading the details underneath it. And today we are going through every single one of those details, statewide first, then zooming all the way into the neighborhood in Spokane where this crisis became a national story. Stick with this one, because the scale of what is happening across Washington right now is genuinely hard to grasp in a single headline. And by the end, you will understand exactly why officials keep using the word unprecedented. If you want to keep tracking this as it develops, subscribing means you will not miss the next update, because as of this recording, containment on the largest fires in this state sits at 0%. Let's start with the number that started all of this. 425,000 acres. That is how much land had already burned across Washington state before this month's crisis even peaked, the most burned in the state since 2021, spread across more than 1,000 separate fire starts in a single season. To put that acreage into perspective, that is a landmass larger than the entire city of Los Angeles, burned in a single state in a single fire season in the Pacific Northwest, a region most Americans associate with rainforests and gray skies, not megafires. And when Governor Bob Ferguson stood in front of cameras and declared a statewide state of emergency, he was not reacting to one fire. He was reacting to a dozen simultaneous fires burning across multiple regions of the state at once, at a scale the state's own Department of Natural Resources said it had not dealt with in 5 years. This was not, in any real sense, a surprise to the people whose job is to track this. Months earlier, the National Interagency Fire Center had already predicted above-average wildfire risk for eastern Washington heading into June, then expanded that outlook to cover nearly the entire eastern half of the state through July, and finally the entire state, coast to mountains, by August. Washington's own legislature had responded to that outlook by more than doubling its firefighting budget for the year, appropriating $120 million, twice what had been set aside the year before. That is not the behavior of a state caught off guard. That is a state that saw this coming, funded accordingly, and still found itself overwhelmed once the wind and the drought and, allegedly, a single spark all lined up on the same weekend. And this would not even be the worst wind-driven fire event in the state's recent memory. Back in September of 2020, wind-driven fires tore through more than 300,000 acres of Washington in a single 24-hour period. An event so extreme it prompted headlines asking how a state could lose that much land before the next morning. This year's crisis did not come out of nowhere. It came out of a pattern the state has now lived through more than once in the last 6 years. Before we get to Spokane, you need to understand how a state actually reaches the point of declaring a wildfire emergency, because it is not a symbolic gesture. It is a legal and operational trigger. Once declared, it authorizes a statewide ban on nearly all outdoor and agricultural burning. Through the end of September, it activates additional Washington National Guard troops beyond what was already deployed, and it opens the door to something called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, a formal system that lets one state call in firefighting crews, engines, and aircraft from other states when its own resources are stretched past their limit. Washington used every part of that authority almost immediately. National Guard helicopter crews were already flying missions before the declaration was even signed. Within days, a full incident management team from California, an entire trained command structure, was on the ground, helping direct operations in the hardest hit county in the state. So which county was that? Spokane. And here's where the geography of this disaster becomes almost impossible to comprehend all at once, because while the Spokane fires were dominating headlines, they were only one front in a much larger war. Up in Okanogan and Lincoln counties, the Kaiser Canyon fire had already burned past 134,000 acres on its own, an area larger than some entire counties on the East Coast. In Ferry County, the Maudrite fire had consumed more than 40,000 acres. Near Chelan, the Little Giant fire had burned close to 29,000. Back in Okanogan County, a separate blaze called the Sinlahican Fire had taken almost 32,000 more. Further south, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest issued an emergency closure order because of yet another fire, the Skyo Fire, burning east of the town of Randall, shutting down entire forest roads to keep the public out of harm's way. Every one of those fires had its own incident command, its own evacuation zones, its own residents watching the sky. And that was the backdrop the state Washington was already fighting, when a spark near a road called Old Trails turned Spokane into the epicenter of the entire crisis. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. None of this happened because Washington suddenly got unlucky. It happened because of a slow-motion trend that has been building for years and that most people outside the state have never heard discussed. Washington entered 2026 in its fourth consecutive year of statewide drought emergency, 4 years in a row. Rewind to the 1990s, and droughts of this scale hit Washington roughly once every 5 years. Today, the state's own Department of Ecology says severe drought conditions have shown up in 4 out of the last 10 years. Their own projections estimate that by 2050, that number climbs to 7 years out of every 10. This is not a random bad summer. This is a documented shift in how often the state's water systems are failing to deliver what the land and the people on it actually need. The truly counterintuitive part is that the winter leading into this fire season was not even dry. Between October and February, Washington actually received slightly above its normal precipitation total. On paper, that sounds like good news. It was not, because the problem was never how much water fell, it was what form it fell in. Warmer winter temperatures meant that precipitation, which should have accumulated as mountain snowpack, fell instead as rain, and rain runs downhill and out to the ocean almost immediately, while snowpack stays locked in the mountains and melts slowly across spring and summer, feeding rivers, soil, and vegetation all season long. When that natural reservoir does not form, the entire state effectively skips its own irrigation system. By midsummer, brush and grasslands across eastern Washington were as dry as they would normally be at the very end of a rainless August, except it was only June. That is the fuel. All that was missing was wind and a spark, and Washington got an unprecedented amount of both at once. State water officials have been blunt about who this hits hardest and who it does not. Cities like Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett, on the wetter western side of the state, planned ahead and largely expect to avoid serious drought impact this year because they built their water systems with exactly this kind of shortfall in mind. It is the drier eastern half of the state, the same counties now covered under the federal emergency declaration, that absorb the worst of it every single time, both in terms of water availability and, as this month proved, in terms of fire risk. That is not a coincidence. Drought and wildfire risk track the same map for the same reason. Less water in the ground means drier vegetation standing above it, and drier vegetation is simply fuel waiting for an ignition source. When state officials say a fourth consecutive drought emergency raises fire danger, this is the literal mechanism they are describing, not an abstract warning. That spark, as far as investigators can currently tell, arrived on a Saturday just before noon near Old Trails Road on Spokane's West Plains. Within roughly 90 minutes, state fire mobilization had been authorized. Within hours, wind gusts between 35 and 45 miles an hour had pushed the fire across the Spokane River and directly into residential neighborhoods on the city's north side. 2 more fires ignited nearby that same day, one near Meade, called the Fairview Fire, another near 9 Mile Falls, called the Autumn Lane Fire, which later absorbed a 4th, smaller fire. Officials made the call to track all 3 together under a single name, the Spokane Complex Fire, because trying to manage them as separate incidents inside a single metro area no longer made operational sense. Within 24 hours, that complex had burned more than 8,000 acres with 0% containment inside city limits and neighborhoods, not forest. The response was enormous, and it still was not enough to stop the destruction. The Veterans Health Administration Hospital in Spokane had to be evacuated along with its satellite clinics. Fairchild Air Force Base ordered evacuations for military families in the danger zone. A community college sheltering evacuees lost power and had to be evacuated a second time, this time to the Spokane Convention Center. The county fairgrounds became an emergency animal shelter, housing close to 200 displaced pets within days. At its peak, roughly 65,000 residents of Spokane County were living under some level of evacuation order, with the highest tier, level 3, meaning leave immediately, in effect, across huge sections of the city's north side. By the time crews could safely get into the hardest hit neighborhoods, more than 600 structures had been confirmed destroyed. A number that continued climbing past 700 as access improved, with officials publicly comparing the scale of loss to the catastrophic Eaton and Palisades fires that devastated the Los Angeles area. Spokane's mayor, Lisa Brown, called it the worst natural disaster her region has ever faced. The disruption reached well beyond the fire lines themselves. Spokane's superior, district, and municipal courts issued emergency orders shutting down parts of their normal operations, pushing active jury trials back by more than a week. Avista, the region's main electric and gas utility, told the public its own repair crews could not safely enter large sections of the burned area, meaning restoring power to survivors depended entirely on how quickly the fire itself could be brought under control. And because the smoke plume from a fire burning this close to a major population center was so dense, the state issued air quality warnings covering areas far beyond the actual evacuation zones, meaning tens of thousands of additional residents who never lost their homes still spent days breathing air rated hazardous, kept indoors, told to avoid exertion, and left checking air quality apps the same way people elsewhere check the weather. A disaster of this size does not end at the evacuation line. It radiates outward into hospitals, courts, utilities, and lungs, for a population many times larger than the number of people who actually had to flee. Here is the number that matters most in all of this, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than sensationalized. As of the most recent confirmed reports, no deaths and no serious injuries have been tied to these fires. Local officials have credited the sheer speed of the evacuation order for that outcome, even as they caution that crews are still working through areas that were too dangerous to enter for days and that the full picture is not finished. More than 200 missing person reports were filed during the chaos of the first weekend alone, the overwhelming majority resolved within days as displaced families reconnected through shelters and hotlines, though a small number remained open as of the latest update. That is what an honest disaster update sounds like. Not a confirmed final number delivered with certainty, but careful, ongoing verification, because getting it wrong in either direction, understating it or overstating it, does real damage to the people living through it. And then the story took a turn nobody was expecting. On the Monday after the fire broke out, a Spokane man was formally charged with first-degree arson, specifically connected to the ignition of the Old Trails fire, the blaze that triggered the entire chain reaction across the city. His bail was set at $1 million. Public records show a prior felony conviction out of Arizona for manslaughter and premeditated murder involving his own adoptive father. The investigation into exactly what happened at that ignition point is still active as this video is being made, and nothing has been proven in a courtroom yet. But it reframes everything that came before it. An entire state under emergency declaration. 6 counties and 3 tribal nations covered by a federal disaster declaration. 65,000 residents displaced. Hundreds of families' homes reduced to ash. And at the very center of the spark that started Spokane's share of it, allegedly, one individual's decision rather than a random act of nature. Following Washington's formal request, the president approved a federal emergency declaration covering Chelan, Ferry, Okanogan, Spokane, Stevens, and Yakima counties, along with the Confederated Tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, and the Spokane Tribe of Indians. That declaration unlocks direct federal coordination through FEMA and funds emergency protective measures at 75% federal cost share, with a federally appointed coordinating officer now overseeing the response alongside state and tribal emergency managers. Members of Congress representing the state across party lines publicly pushed the White House for this declaration within hours of the Spokane fires exploding, which tells you plainly how fast this moved from a regional wildfire story to a full national disaster response. Where does all of this stand as of right now? Cooler temperatures and calmer winds gave crews a genuine window over the past few days, their best working conditions since the fires began, and containment lines finally started to hold in parts of the Spokane complex. But that window is closing. Forecasters have already warned that hotter, drier conditions are expected to return within days, on top of a drought that has not actually broken, on top of a snowpack situation that remains worse than last year, which was already considered alarming. This is not a story with a resolved ending. It is a live, ongoing emergency. And anyone in the affected counties should be following official Washington emergency management alerts and county-level evacuation maps directly rather than any single video, because these numbers can and will change. Step back far enough, and Washington's summer fits into a pattern showing up across the entire American West. Wildfires that used to stay contained to forest and rangeland are increasingly behaving like urban conflagrations, jumping from roofline to roofline once they reach dense residential development, exactly the way the Spokane complex jumped a river and tore through entire blocks of houses in a matter of hours. It is the same basic pattern seen in the Eaton and Palisades fires in the Los Angeles area. And fire scientists have been warning for years that this is what happens when drought-primed vegetation sits directly against dense neighborhoods, and then a serious wind event arrives on top of it. The infrastructure cannot stop a fire moving like that. The only thing that can meaningfully change the outcome is how fast people get out of its way and how prepared entire states are, financially and logistically, to fight several of these fires simultaneously without running out of resources. So if you live anywhere near this kind of risk, whether that is Eastern Washington, California, Colorado, Texas, or anywhere else where dry vegetation and high wind regularly collide, here is what is actually worth doing today rather than after the next warning goes out. Learn your local evacuation zone and alert system now, and understand the difference between a get ready notice and a leave now order before you're standing in your driveway trying to figure it out in real time. Keep a go bag packed year-round with medications, documents, and essentials, so a sudden level 3 order does not turn into a frantic scramble. Photograph your home and belongings now and store that record somewhere other than the house itself, because insurance recovery moves dramatically faster with proof in hand. Track your local air quality index during fire season, even if you are nowhere near the flames. And keep a supply of N95 masks on hand, because smoke exposure affects far more people than the fire line itself ever will. And build a family communication plan that does not rely entirely on cell networks, because those networks buckle under pressure exactly when you need them most, the same way a shelter in Spokane lost power in the middle of an active evacuation. If you're further out from the fire itself, but still inside the smoke plume, do not assume you are unaffected just because you are not under an evacuation order. Set your phone to receive wireless emergency alerts. Follow your county emergency management office directly rather than relying on secondhand social media posts, and check on elderly neighbors or family members who may not see digital alerts at all. Small, unglamorous preparation, done before the warning arrives rather than after, is consistently the single biggest factor separating communities that come through a fire season with property loss alone from communities that lose lives as well. Spokane's outcome this month, hundreds of homes destroyed, but as of now, 0 confirmed deaths, is not luck. It is what a fast, well-executed evacuation actually buys a community, even when everything else about the disaster goes as badly as it possibly could. It is also worth remembering that a wildfire season like this one does not just cost homes, it costs the systems meant to fight the next one. Firefighting crews who spent the past several days on the Spokane complex are the same finite pool of personnel needed for the Kaiser Canyon Fire, the Maudrite Fire, the Little Giant Fire, and every other blaze still burning uncontained elsewhere in the state. Every mutual aid crew pulled in from California or another state is a resource that is not available if a fire breaks out somewhere else next week. That is precisely why officials at every level, state, tribal, and federal, moved as fast as they did to formalize emergency declarations and open access to outside resources. A single overwhelming fire season does not just threaten one city. It threatens the state's entire capacity to respond to whatever comes next for the rest of the season. What is happening in Washington right now is not a freak event. It is the visible result of a multi-year drought trend, a warming winter pattern that is quietly dismantling the state's natural water storage system. And, if investigators are right, a single reckless human decision that turned already dangerous conditions into a defining disaster for an entire American city. The fires are not out. The containment lines are not finished. And the heat, according to the people whose job it is to track it, is coming back this week. We will keep following this as new numbers come in on containment, on the federal recovery effort, and on the criminal case tied to how the Old Trails fire actually started. Subscribe if you want those updates the moment they land, and drop a comment if you have ever lived through an evacuation yourself, because these numbers only tell half the story, and the people living through them are the ones who tell the rest. Wherever you are watching this from, take a moment today to think about whether you and your own family would actually be ready if an order to leave now landed on your phone tonight. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one.